Welcome to the latest edition of Akin's Speaking Sustainability Podcast. I'm your host, Chad Smith, the consultant with the firm specializing in environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, and corporate law matters. My guests today are Jim Deeken and Kirk Anderson. Jim is an Akin partner who represents a wide range of private fund managers in fund formation activities and in investments into a wide range of investment funds. He's an adjunct lecturer at SMU's Dedman School of Law and writes and speaks extensively on a wide range of issues. Most recently, Jim authored All the Best Intentions versus Real-World Realities, a cost-based ESG method for managing securities disclosure and greenwashing risk, which was published this last summer in the Securities Regulation Law Journal. Kirk is a counsel in Akin's investment management group, where he represents domestic and offshore investment funds, focusing on advising fund sponsors, the formation, structuring, and operation of investment funds. Kirk also advises clients in relation to regulatory and compliance issues under U.S. and international securities laws. Jim and Kirk, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you for doing this again.
Yeah, glad to be here, Chad. Thanks.
Jim, during our last podcast together, we talked about the duties of a corporate director under Delaware law and how such directors should think about risk mitigation when serving as a corporate director, including in relation to risks posed by ESG issues. In your latest article, you turn your attention to how companies, including boards and management, might strike a new balance between identifying and committing to certain ESG principles and the realities, financial and otherwise, for example, political, that can frequently constrain the actual realization of those principles. This tension can lead to greenwashing, or in some cases, green hushing. How do you define greenwashing and green hushing for these purposes?
Well, so greenwashing is exactly what happens when somebody makes a statement about some social, some environmental, some safety measure, maybe you call it ESG measure, that they say that they follow, or they will follow. Then what greenwashing results when there's a gap between that statement and what actually happens in practice. Green hushing is a term you haven't heard as much, but that tends to be basically saying they're going to do something and backing away from it, or trying to use statistics to obscure what's really going on, closely related to greenwashing. But both of them deal with that fundamental gap between rhetoric on one hand and reality on the other.
You seem to see a lot, particularly in sort of the sustainability space, or sort of, I make a public commitment relative to a particular emissions target, and then, or that a product investment or consumer product has been produced in a sustainable way or is meant to achieve a particular result. Is that sort of the way to think about it in terms of the gap?
I think so. I think that's partly, there's various reasons why that may occur. Some of it may be impure motives, but I think a lot of it is the fact that when we talk about a business, it's not one person, it's multiple people. Business doesn't have a brain, right? So it's multiple people, and you could be talking to different sides of the corporation, different sides of the businesses. They may have different views, different perspectives on what actually goes on. So I think a lot of this greenwashing results from not being internally aligned with everybody on the same page as to what practices are, what they will be, what is feasible, what the trade-offs are.
And also, I think what is vetted from a realistic standpoint, within the company to go along with that. And, Jim, in his article, talks about, the role of compliance people and lawyers and how, the whole firm collectively acting together can mitigate greenwashing risk to close that gap between the disclosed practices and what's actually going on. The practices don't have to be nefarious. And the disclosure, surrounding a good practice, can be inaccurate even if it's not intentional.
Well, you touch on Jim's articles. I guess one of the things that we wanted to look at is, so in the article, you suggest that companies can benefit from approaching ESG and sustainability issues from a cost-based approach, for example, cost-benefit analysis approach. And you argue that doing so, quote, may also allow corporations to adopt a more realistic ESG narrative that better focuses its attention on ESG initiatives that are realistic for it, company, thereby reducing potential greenwashing risks. Can you maybe sort of explain a little bit more specifically what you mean by that?
Sure. So I think one thing to consider is that profit and cost are not necessarily consistent with ESG or ESG rhetoric. So a lot of things that are so-called ESG, which seems like a pejorative label to some people, but you could call it socially responsible operations. People don't like that term. But a lot of these objectives, environmental, safety, employment, well-being, they also align with the goal of maximizing profits or shareholder value as well. So, for example, if you're running a company that has a lot of factories, certainly it's very benevolent and altruistic to run your factories in a way that minimizes harmful emissions. But if it also minimizes your risk of being fined by the EPA or other government regulatory agencies, if it minimizes your tort liability, if it minimizes negative publicity, then those are the type of things that may increase your profits too. It may increase long-term value for the business. Not to say that that'll be the case in all circumstances, but there could be an alignment between business objectives and the altruistic objectives as well. The concept of cost, I think, is important because sometimes there's a disconnect in business actors about being aligned internally, as I alluded to earlier. And so people might say, we're going to pursue altruistic objective A, B, C, and D. And there's no consideration maybe by the people making the statement about what are the costs involved in doing that. And because of that, a realistic perspective is sometimes lost. And I think that's one of the things that leads to a greenwashing risk.
Jim, is it possible, a corporation could have a hunch that there's a waste, from an environmental perspective? You just talked about, initiatives that could actually save money. A corporation, again, that runs a lot of factories could analyze its carbon footprint in an effort to, save on energy costs. Do you think about corporate waste and internal analysis of waste as an effort to bring in a cost savings as a good way that a corporation could have a mutually beneficial ESG initiative?
Very much so. And so we see that you and I do investment management primarily. We see investment managers who sometimes take the position that we do socially responsible investing. We have an ESG policy that we use to maximize profits for our investors. So they try to align the two to the extent that they can. And then when there's a disconnect, it's just an issue of disclosing it, saying, we're not going to pursue a certain type of investment, and that might cause our returns to be lower.
Your point there sort of leads me to think about sort of how regulators are thinking about this, and in particular, given that we're sitting here in the U.S., how the SEC and other sort of regulators and agencies think about these issues. Now, since our last recording, the SEC is actually what some people would say is quietly disbanded its ESG and climate task force. But I don't think that means, and the SEC has certainly said that it doesn't mean that they are not going to continue to focus on ESG related issues and the scrutiny that certainly has come relative to greenwashing issues. Why do you think that this has become such an area of focus for the SEC and other regulators?
I think part of it is the ideological and policy perspectives, viewpoints of the regulators, especially in the current administration. Of course, that could change in a few months, one way or the other. But a lot of times there's no law or regulation requiring somebody to pursue ESG policies or ESG initiatives or climate mitigation initiatives other than comply with the laws that are on the books. So I think what the regulators try to do is they'll try to say, we can't force a business to do these altruistic things. But if they say they've done them and they haven't done them, then that's a violation of law, and that's something that we could enforce. So I think the disclosure aspect is giving the regulators a hook to try to maybe indirectly bring about some results they can't do directly because the law is limited in its current state.
Yeah, I mean,
and
go ahead, Kirk, sorry.
And the concept that a company can't lie to its investors in a regulatory disclosure or in a SEC filing is nothing new, and it's that's always been the case. A lot of the reason for the focus area on ESG disclosures and greenwashing is just because it's become such a buzzword in recent years, and because it's such a popular concept in recent years. With more and more consumers focusing on the environmental or social or governance practices of the companies that they buy products from, more companies want to get out there and make these statements, even in their regulatory disclosures. So that's I think a big part of the reason is it is market driven, and the SEC is and other regulators are focusing on it for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, I mean, to Jim's point, or point that you're both making, is if you look at the SEC's climate rule, which is subject to legal challenge currently in the Eighth Circuit, some would argue that the disclosure rules were, to Jim's point, intended to sort of push a result, and arguably some of the folks challenging that rule would say, well, if that climate issue is material to your operations or your business, we should be disclosing it anyway. Do you have a particular view on that, either of you?
I think that's right. I think there's a viewpoint that if these things are material, that they would have to be disclosed anyway. I think there's also the maybe underlying rationale is if somebody's a regulator, they want to try to enforce these ESG principles, and companies don't make statements about these principles, and it's kind of hard to enforce them because there's no rhetoric to apply against the company. So in a way, I think some of these regulations are intended to get companies off the fence by forcing them to make public statements that can then be evaluated. So maybe it's the opposite of green hushing, Chad. Maybe it's, what's the word of hushing? Shouting. Green shouting, maybe, is what they're trying to force people to do.
You're going to coin a new phrase for the market.
And it's important that companies keep an eye on this, as in the US, especially as these regulations roll out. The SEC has been sitting on the investment advisor ESG disclosure rule for a while, but there could be more regulation in the near future that forces companies to get off the fence, as Jim says.
Yeah, I think that's particularly true. I mean, we see California has adopted its own disclosure obligations. That also remains subject to legal challenge, but the state is certainly proceeding as though those disclosure requirements are going to go into effect. So that's something obviously that we're keeping an eye on. Let's turn to the sort of litigation that is being brought in relation to these sorts of claims, and maybe just for the benefit of our listeners, talk a moment, Jim, about the sorts of claims that are being brought and what sort of allegations are being made by the plaintiffs.
There's a couple claims. Ironically, a few of them are in the New York districts, and they allege false claims about sustainability, biodegradable products. So some private plaintiffs are starting to bring claims. Of course, these may be class actions, so there may be an incentive of lawyers to try to find excuses to do it. I think it's an emerging area where I think companies need to be careful about it, and they kind of look over their shoulder and say, okay, not only is the SEC my only potential bulldog, but also there's private actors. There's also potential civil liability from private plaintiffs in connection with these statements that I make, particularly if the company is public and you have a diverse group of stockholders where there's more risk of shareholder or stockholder litigation. So I think it's just really reinforces the need, especially if somebody's public and they're making public reporting, to really carefully vet all of their statements and not just cut and paste what other companies do.
Yeah, I think that sounds exactly right. One of the questions that pops up is whether there are particularly unique risks facing investment advisors in this space. And I know you've given some thought to that issue. Would you mind spending a moment just sort of talking to our listeners about sort of those issues and how you think about them?
Yeah, I think about it from a very basic level. Investment advisors want to sell their funds, and if they've got the strategies that they think are worth an investor's time, they're going to market those funds. And as I mentioned before, ESG has become such a hot buzzword in the past 5 years, and so many investment managers have tried to get aboard the bandwagon. Yeah, in the rush to do that, a manager may create for itself a greenwashing problem, right? I don't want to get left out here. I know this is popular with a lot of consumers and a lot of people who are looking to invest, and so they're going to make a statement about either their funds and the investment strategies of their funds, or of the investment manager itself, right? From a investment manager corporate perspective, it could be something like an ambitious climate goal or, employee wellness or something of that nature. And from that perspective, they got to watch out for the same considerations in greenwashing that any other operating company would watch out for, right? Like avoiding superlatives or making sure that you can actually give some cost analysis to your climate goal, like is it achievable for us to do this before we actually disclose it? Those kinds of considerations. And then there are considerations as to the funds they market. Are the portfolio companies that the funds are investing in actually living up to the ESG standards that the investment manager is claiming? Jim writes in his article that quote unquote ESG funds may not always include portfolio companies that practice the ESG practices you might expect. So it's twofold for managers, I think, at a very basic level.
And that's
Oh, go ahead, Jim.
surprisingly, most managers can put caveated language in their responsible investing or ESG policies to address that we're still going to try to make money and we're still going to, I mean, we're going to avoid every single investment. It's one of many things that we consider. So managers do have the ability to do that. And I think it's important that they consider where that is necessary for their statements to be accurate.
Going back to your article, you referred to the sort of costs and challenges of ESG. And I was wondering if you could spend a moment sort of explaining what you mean by that and understanding how those factors serve as what you refer to as a good starting place for a company to manage and minimize greenwashing risks.
Well, I think it's important for people to go back and think about what objectives are we going to try to pursue and what limitations might we actually have on those. So for example, if you have a business that runs a retail stores across the country and they say, we strongly support the rights of workers to do whatever, then they also oppose unionization, ever to unionize. Well, is that, be careful where you're going to trade off and what you're going to do, and think about how the statements need to be caveated, because there are costs, and costs are important. And if costs aren't minimized, if the business operates in a competitive economy and the costs go up more than the cost of a competitor, then that could threaten the long-term viability of the company, even if it pursues socially admirable goals. So that's something to consider. So I think really that's one side of the equation, Chad, but the other side is, that may sound a little dismal, but I think the other side is a profit aspect as well. So I think the problem that we have, I think, is that the rhetoric on ESG and socially responsible investing is so polarized that I think both sides talk past each other. And I think they also demonize each other, so they don't necessarily want to talk to each other. And I think we see that with our political rhetoric, which seems like it gets coarser and coarser over time. And I think that really there's an opportunity for people who might be viewed as ESG opponents to consider that there's some opportunities for improvements, minimizing legal risk, reducing costs of litigation, fines, retaining employees in the long term. There's some things that are profit maximizing ESG, as I referred to in the article, at least. And then there are other side of the coin. I think the proponents of ESG also need to realize that as admirable as these social goals are, companies need to be profitable. Otherwise, absent some sort of large government subsidy, they will cease to exist. And investors, as much as investors like to highlight socially responsible goals, investors don't make investments in companies to lose money. And they don't make investments in companies even to break even. So I think that there needs to be some acknowledgement of reality on both sides and some effort to find some common ground.
Beneficial common ground, right?
Yeah.
Where an ESG opponent and an ESG proponent actually might be totally aligned in certain areas. Jim mentioned that it sounds dismal that maybe this concept of pure ESG about a company may be rare, but why not take what you can get? Why not go for an easy win?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you touch on a really important point, which is, sort of marrying the two concepts, right? Like the goals of your ESG product or program or policy or whatever certainly can be married up with your long-term creation of value for stakeholders, as well as, exercising and discharging your fiduciary duties in a way that is required by being in management or on the board. One of the things that you also talk about in your piece, Jim, are two recent critiques of ESG and some lessons around greenwashing. I was wondering if you could sort of spend a minute talking about the material that you reference in the piece by Professors Bainbridge and McLean, and what you think we can learn from them.
Sure. Professor Bainbridge is a law professor at UCLA, and his book is largely based on the legal aspects of maximizing shareholder value. It's a good legal framework for people to understand the legal consequences under the current law of companies pursuing ESG and some of the legal trade-offs involved in that. I think that's probably a book more for lawyers. I think probably the book that's a more general application is the book by Professor McLean, who's at Georgetown Business School. I think that's useful because he does a very good job of explaining business principles to people who aren't in the finance industry, such as myself. And I think it's just interesting and educational to learn about some of the pressures that corporations, businesses operate under and how that may interact with ESG.
I'll have to pick those up for sure. Before we close, your article includes some practical advice that I think our listeners would benefit from hearing, subject to the usual caveats around not creating a legal relationship, et cetera, et cetera. But it'd be great, Jim and Kirk, if you could maybe just spend a few minutes talking about sort of that practical advice and how our clients and potential clients can think about coming at these issues, particularly when they want to engage in the sort of ESG related product development, product offering, et cetera. Spend a minute talking about that, if you would.
So my basic goal, and what I do with clients when I review their responsible investing statements or ESG statements, is to try to avoid using buzzwords or superlative statements. So the thing that always drives me nuts, for example, is if you have a mining company and they say, we maintain our properties in the safest way possible. Well, that's not true. I mean, the safest thing to do with a mine would be to shut it down, right? Is that what they're doing? No. So we do run a factory in the safest way possible. The safest way possible might be to have 2 safety officers of every employee looking over their shoulder. So it's important to taper back those somewhat superlative statements into things that are more reasonable, such as we consider safety what we consider to be a reasonable safety method. We have safety checks, we have safety screens, we have safety policies. Those are things you could say instead of saying we're the best in class. Does that mean that nobody on the planet has a safer operation than you do? Can't possibly be the case, right? It sounds good, but it needs to be tempered with true statements. And I think there's a way to do this, Chad, because I think a lot of companies that have their public relations people write these ESG statements who don't operate the business. So I think it's important for people to really get internally aligned and to have everybody at the company who's a stakeholder in the company in what these statements address weighing in and trying to make sure that what is being said is actually accurate. I think a lot of things companies could do too is if they're going to say that we're going to, for example, pursue an objective or we're going to use sustainable products. Well, what does that mean? You're always going to use sustainable products? What if they cost 3 times as much? So could you say something to the effect of, we believe sustainable products are important. We're going to think about opportunities to integrate them into our business where practical. So you're not just out there saying you're absolutely going to do it, because in reality, that's probably not going to be the case, unfortunately. I think another thing to do would be people who make these statements should probably do an internal tracking of all their ESG statements. So I know it sounds work intensive, but basically label out the ESG statement and then think about what areas of the business does it impact and what are the decision points that are going to be implemented, who's going to make those decisions, make sure everybody signs off internally on how that is being done. And then also having policies in place to make sure that the practices check those statements. So if there's an error, you deviate from those statements in practice, that can be caught and corrected, as opposed to just what I think a lot of people are tempted to do, just write a good sounding ESG statement on a piece of paper, put it on the internet, and just assume that everybody at the company is angelically going to follow it.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the really critically piece of this, which is the sort of governance structures that enable proper oversight of these sorts of programs and policies and what have you. And maybe Kirk, you could spend a minute talking about some other areas of compliance. I know the SEC has been super focused on record keeping, for example. As you advise your clients sort of on the compliance issue, what are some things that you focus on?
Well, continuing along on what Jim said, this is a great place to give compliance professionals and lawyers a role, right? Jim mentioned having procedures that allow for a mapping of ESG statements, and that can be vital. Taking a log of all the statements that are made across your disclosures, coming up with a rubric of what is acceptable, what is not. If we're going to make a superlative statement, probably not going to work. If you're going to make some other kind of unencumbered statement, as tempting as it may be, with ESG initiatives being as popular as they are, come up with a set of disclosures or a set of rules within your company that work. And even if it's a big workload up front to come up with all of that, going forward, you can be sure that you have something that shows what your company is actually doing, and B, that you can show to a regulator to say, look, we've worked on this.
Yeah.
And we're not a nefarious actor here.
Yeah, creating that sort of record is so important, both for sort of protecting the company and its constituents, but also just to both of your point, to being able to demonstrate to the regulator that you've given some thought to this and that you weren't sort of off on a frolic as you were making these disclosures. And
So just a couple of interesting points on your point, Chad, about the governance. So some investment managers have gotten in trouble with the SEC on exam because they'll say things, for example, that when we do an investment, we have an investment committee, we go through an ESG analysis process for every investment. In reality, they haven't always done that. And so the SEC has pointed out on enforcement actions that sometimes these investment managers have practices that don't actually match what they're doing. So it really hits home the point that you made, Chad and Kirk, about governance. So if somebody's going to make these ESG statements, there really needs to be an internal compliance and governance system to make sure that they're actually followed. And what I think is a little bit ironic, Chad, as you mentioned, governance is the G in ESG, right? And this also dovetails with the prior podcast you and I did about the responsibility of officers and directors under Delaware's Caremark doctrine to make sure that corporate risks are being reduced. So all of this kind of comes full circle in my view. And so I think your point about governance is something that I don't think really gets enough attention, because I don't think people are necessarily aware of the importance of it. And I think that people view ESG statements as statements that are put out there. And I know people do a lot of work to put them together, and people should do a lot of work and maybe even more work to make sure that they're accurate. But once the statement is out there, in reality, I think as we're all saying, that's not where the work ends. That's where the work begins. Because then you have a statement out there saying what you're going to do. That doesn't end it. That just begins it, because you actually have to do it. And you have to make sure you're doing it. You make sure that you revise the statement if you need to revise the statement from time to time. So that's just, I think there's a real issue. I think this is what leads to greenwashing, Chad, is there's a real issue with people just making these statements and letting them live and then not doing the follow-up work on them.
Yeah, and that's a great opportunity to employ your annual compliance review or other regular compliance reviews at the firm, especially for asset managers. If Jim mentioned companies getting dinged for failure to comply with their internal procedures on ESG reviews that go into investment decisions, making sure that those procedures are being followed by everywhere they're supposed to be followed at any given desk is a good use of time in an annual compliance review.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful feedback. We've reached the end of our time. I want to thank you both for taking the time. I thought this was a super informative discussion, and look forward to the next opportunity to chat with you.
Well, the next opportunity, Chad, I'll say that the challenge is basically what the heck we're going to talk about on podcast 3.
Well, you need to keep writing, and we'll figure it out. So,
okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
OnAir with Akin is presented by Akin and cannot be copied or rebroadcast without consent. The information provided is intended for a general audience and is not legal advice or a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship is being created by this podcast, and all rights are reserved.